Technicians of Spaceship Earth, welcome back to Hawkbinge, your guide through the astral plane that is the Hawkwind discography, one album at a time in the company of a long-term fan, which is me, and your favourite first-time listener, which is Matt. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Andy. How are you?
I am very well indeed. And yourself?
I'm doing okay. A little bit on the struggle bus this morning for me. It was a night of fire last night, a little bit. I actually had a DJ gig, which went very well, which was a lot of fun. I even was able to sneak in a 7x7 into it because it was just a 7-inch only DJ set, which was a lot of fun because it means that you just have to play records that you've actually gone and found and really like, you know, enough to invest in. It was a very enjoyable night, but I woke up a little bit dusty this morning.
I can hear the round of applause ringing out around Hawkwind world. The idea of 7x7 being played at a club night in New York, that's excellent work. And yeah, feeling pretty energized for this one, got to say, after the rather long hiatus we had between Sonic Attack and Church of Hawkwind. This has been much more back to our regular rhythm. I noticed it is exactly 30 days since we dropped the Church of Hawkwind episode. It usually takes us a week or so to put these things together once we've recorded, so this will come out just over a month after the last one, which is pretty much, I think, as good a rhythm as we can get into. So this is pretty fresh.
Oh, massively. And what an album it is, actually. Just to spoiler alert, my hot take on this one. It's been great to have this hot on the heels of so much Church of Hawkwind listening.
Indeed. And it's an interesting one for me too. This was one of the albums I got in my first wave of Hawkwind album collecting. So it's been an interesting one to come back to. But as ever, Hawkwind is not the only thing on the turntable. It kind of sits in between other things that we're playing, and it's interesting to find out what those things are. I think I know one thing you've been playing a fair bit recently, Matt.
Yeah, the new Porcupine Tree album dropped quite spectacularly. Closure Continuation. I'm going to get this wrong if I actually quote dates, but I'm just going to go ahead and say that it has been a while since Porcupine Tree dropped an album. Steven Wilson, who is the front person and probably the main brain behind Porcupine Tree, shelved it for quite some time and went and did all his own stuff. But to have it come back, it has a sound which he doesn't do himself. You know what I mean? It still feels very minor, very haunting, quite dystopian feels. There's quite a lot of psychology in it where I feel like although he does do some of that in his own work, I feel like he saves the more like gritty stuff for Porcupine Tree. So for him to come out with a new album for this year was quite spectacular.
Absolutely. As you can all tell, we are massive Steven Wilson and Porcupine Tree fans. Apparently, it's 13 years since the incident that we went and saw the tour. We saw a Hammersmith Odeon show of the incident. And then, as you say, he shelved it for a while and did his solo stuff. And I think Porcupine Tree was always completely written by Steven Wilson. He was the sole writer in the band. And the idea, I think, was that if it was to come back, it needed to be a band contribution. So now Porcupine Tree in a 3-piece with Gavin Harrison and the other guy on keyboards, whose name I've completely forgotten. But no disrespect to him, apart from the fact that is massively disrespectful. They've written a lot of material for this, and it is a band piece that's taken shape over quite a long time, over lockdown. And yeah, you're right, it sounds like Porcupine Tree from the word go. And because of the way those guys play, it doesn't sound like anything that Steven done on his own. Steven Wilson, obviously famed in Hawkwind for doing his remix of Warrior on the Edge of Time for the box set, so there's a crossover there. So yeah, we need to pick a track to go on the Hawkbinge Sessions playlist.
Yeah, my favourite right now is probably Herd Culling. Can't really tell you why. It seems to be the one that when it comes on, I just feel like extra into it. How about you?
They obviously released Harridan quite a long time back as they were kind of seeding the album, and I love Harridan. But also I love A New Day, and usually the ballads are slightly lower down in my pecking order, but I love A New Day. But honestly, it's such a consistent album, I could go with anything. So let's put Herd Culling on the Hawkbinge Sessions playlist.
That's very gracious of you.
Well, that's kind of mood I'm in. Yeah, what else have you been listening to, Matt? these past few weeks?
Well, I've been listening to a lot of things trying to put this set together. And one thing I tend to do when I'm DJing vinyl is that I have one track which I always go to start a set, because I just feel like it has an infectious groove. It's very easy then to get people into the vibe that you're setting out to build. It starts very ambiently, but then ends in this big crescendo, which allows you to then mix out of that into something. You can kind of go in any direction you want after that. I have actually shamelessly stolen this from James Lavelle, who is the frontman of Uncle, UNKLE, who I saw play this track. I think it was in Fabrica, maybe like 2001, 2002, and had to actually find him at the bar afterwards and ask him what it was. And the track is Circles by the Psychonauts on the album Songs for Creatures. And the Psychonauts are Pablo Clement and Paul Mogg, and Pablo is actually part of Uncle. So this was his side project. They only as a band made one album, but it's a great album. It's got so much groove, so much electronic experimentation. It feels really of that kind of big beat time, but with a nice bit of 70s style groove over the top of it. You know, like we talked about before with tracks that whenever you play it, you become its mood. I feel like there's never a time when I haven't played this and seen at least a few people in the crowd cock their ear like, oh, I wonder where this is going. And that's always very satisfying. So yeah, Psychonauts, Circles on Songs for Creatures on the International DJ Gigolo Records label. Top track.
Sounds very cool. On a subject of vinyl, I went through a massive vinyl buying binge recently. There is a online record shop called Cosmic Records, Kozmik, which I advise everyone to check out. So I was in a mood to buy some vinyl. I bought a lot of new stuff, but at the same time, I watched 2 documentaries on Sky Arts, I think it is. And I love band stories and album stories and band histories, and I don't really care who the band is. I just find them fascinating. There was one on Yes, and there was one on Jimi Hendrix. They're both really, really good. And that put me in mind of the fact I didn't own Electric Ladyland by Jimi Hendrix, which just feels like such a miss. I also haven't ever heard a Yes album, which, given the other stuff I like, seems surprising. I knew the band story inside out, back to front, who was in it, when and why. I know 1 or 2 songs, like, you know, Owner of a Lonely Heart, one tends to know, but I'd never heard an album. I didn't own Fragile, I didn't own Close to the Edge, and I thought, well, I'll just buy an album. So this is the story of 2 albums. They both arrived at the same time. I bought Close to the Edge by Yes because it's an anniversary and they just played it. And I played both these albums. And it's fair to say, I had very different reactions to them. Close to the Edge, I didn't get it at all. I kind of expected to fall into it quite easily, and in fact, it didn't connect with me on any level apart from the last track was all right. I can't remember what it's called, and this is obviously heresy for everybody out there who probably likes Yes a lot more than I do. And I suddenly realised I should just have listened to it on Spotify and realised I didn't like it. Electric Ladyland, on the other hand, what an album it is. I mean, it's got a lot of stuff on it that you just know anyway. You know, it's got Voodoo Child is on it, Gypsy Eyes is on it, All Along the Watchtower, his cover of Dylan is on it, Crosstown Traffic is on it. So there's a lot of stuff you just know. But the album as a whole is glorious. And it's a beautiful reissue of the album as well. Just such a good pressing. So Electric Ladyland by Jimi Hendrix is my totally unsurprising album of choice for my first one, on Reprise from 1970. And the track of choice that I'm going to shove on to the playlist is Crosstown Traffic, just because it will sit in the playlist really nicely.
I don't know where Owner of a Lonely Heart came from with Yes. I love that track, and I actually played it at the set. Again, it's one of those tracks which somehow just works still. It's just a solid groove. But if you listen to anything else they've done, I don't know what possessed them, but I'm glad they did. But it's a very, very different to like everything else that I know. I grew up with Yes. My dad had a lot of Yes records.
Okay.
So I'm very aware of them. But I do remember listening to Owner of a Lonely Heart and then someone telling me that it was Yes, and I refused to believe it.
Yeah, it's a massive about turn. But the lineup by then is so totally different. I could talk ad length about Yes's band makeup and the membership and the politics and everything else. I just couldn't name you any songs. So if we did Yes Binge, I would be on the other side. I would be listening to albums for the first time and going, what?
So it would be called Yes, but with a question mark. Like, yes?
So yeah, there you go. What else for you?
Speaking of buying records, you sometimes go into a record shop and you see something that you've been looking for and you get really excited. I had that recently. A record shop close to me called Human Head had a copy of Earth 2, which is the first album, weirdly, by Earth. They had a copy of the original 1993 clear vinyl pressing from Sub Pop in its cellophane and were asking nowhere near what they should have been asking for it. So I bagged that and listened to it and really enjoyed it. It's great to fill in the one missing record from my Earth collection. And after listening to it, it made me want to start listening to Primitive and Deadly again, which is probably my favorite Earth album. And it's actually one that we have seen them play. I think we saw them play that at least 2 or 3 times. We became pretty big Earth fans. I feel like it was after seeing Sun, we were looking for stuff that was in that realm. And obviously no one does Sun apart from Sun. But I feel like Earth is very good at taking that ponderous, super slow pacing, but maintaining rock and metal trappings and delivering them with such detail and confidence that you really start to appreciate the chords and the construction. And there's only 2 of them. I think there's like a drummer and a guitarist. And so to get all that sound from just a 2-piece is pretty crazy. My favorite track on that album is Even Hell Has Its Heroes. It's very simple, but again, just goes round and round and round with enough variation each time that you're just like nodding along to it. It's almost quite hypnotic. And that is on Southern Lord. I have like 3 copies of that album because they keep re-releasing it in different colors and I can't figure out which color I like to listen to it the most. So I think I have a black, a green and a purple version. So I was listening to the purple version, which sounds really, really good.
Yeah, good shout, good shout. And my last one is actually from our Desert Festy vibe as well, because it actually is a Desert Fest discovery for me from the very, very first Desert Fest I think I was at with our friend Dwan, which is Zoltan. Because I go back to Zoltan many times because they're the only band that sound like they do. So if I want that fix, it has to be them. And they played the top floor of the Black Heart, that tiny stage. And I got right to the front and they're a 3-piece. There's a guy called Andy Prestige on the drums, Matt Thompson on the bass, and Matt's brother Andy plays the keyboards. And it's all about Andy Thompson and the keyboards, because apparently the whole band exists because Andy Thompson has an outrageous collection of 1970s and 1980s analog synthesizers, and they just wanted to make music with them. And this guy has like a setup that, you know, he's surrounded by keyboards and pedals. And on this album, I'm going to talk about, he plays a Roland Jupiter 8, a Roland Juno 6, SCI Prophet 5, SCI Pro 1, Mellotron, Selena String Ensemble, ARP Odyssey, ARP Pro DGX Mini Moog, Moog Tourist, Moog Rogue, Yamaha CS50, Roland JX3P, Roland SH1000, Fender Rose, Hofner Clavinet, and Korg Mini Moog 700. So you can get the idea. Zoltan sound like the soundtrack to every 1970s horror sci-fi B-movie by John Carpenter, David Cronenberg. Just that beautiful, deep Moog, bassy sounds. All the music is inspired by those kind of movies as well. So there are things from different movies. Psychomania was one that they did a new soundtrack to. It's an amazing sound. They're all really, really good. They've only released 2 full-on studio albums. Stage 1, Zoltan, and 60 Minute Zoom. And 60 Minute Zoom came out in 2014 on Cineploy. I think I'm saying that right. I've never heard anyone say it out loud. Cineploit. It wasn't on Spotify when I was last listening to Zoltan, which is why I didn't recommend it for the playlist, because obviously we couldn't put a song on the playlist. Now it all is. So the Ossuary is the track I'm suggesting, although the Integral is probably the standout track, but it's 25 minutes long and therefore not really playlist worthy. But yep, go and check out 60 Minute Zoom and you'll find the Ossuary on the playlist, and we will be publishing a new playlist after this, Matt.
Yeah, drawing a line under this stage of Hawkwind quite nicely.
Exactly.
Along with our collected tracks, which is very cool. And then we'll be starting number 5. I feel like we're getting quite a body of work under this podcast. It's really nice.
Yes, and they all have very, very different feels to them. I went through the 3 that are on there at the minute, and because of the Hawkwind music that's on there, obviously is moving through the years and through the albums, through the decades even, they have a particular feel to them. I think this one will be no different.
Absolutely.
And with all that said, before we plough on, there are a couple of things to look back at. One, we have a correction that should be made to something that I said about Church of Hawkwind, When going through the people who contributed to Church of Hawkwind, I pointed out that there were a couple of names in there that would come back in the future, i.e. Alan Davey on the bass, Richard Chadwick on the drums, and our good friend of the pod, Mr. Joe Banks, pointed out that actually Alan Davey and Richard Chadwick both played on stuff somewhat after this period that ended up being put back on the extended version of the album for like the double album reissue. So they weren't around at the time. It's just that the cast list, when you look it up, makes it seem like they were. So thanks to Joe for that. And then the other thing we did was, on the last episode, we spoke to Brian Pitkin when we were recapping the Sonic Attack Ultimate Deathmatch Tournament. And at the end of the chat, you kind of out of the blue asked him, who would you like to hear record the vocal for Sonic Attack? And he came out with what I still think is the genius answer, particularly given that he hadn't had time to think about it, of Tom Waits. When we posted this question on Twitter, we got a flood of responses. Any that stand out for you?
Someone said Christopher Lee, which sounds like a suitably dramatic version of this, I think, which is cool. Someone also did mention Neil Nunes. I didn't realize who that was until I realized that he does the shipping forecast.
Yes.
Which I feel like would be a great remix, because you could be like, chance of Sonic Attack, moderate or good. Which I feel would be quite fun.
There were some genius ones, yeah. Dave Robinson suggested Laurie Anderson. Angus Doug came out with the inspired suggestion of Mark E. Smith. I don't know how familiar you are, Matt, with The Fall, but Mark E. Smith has a completely unique signature voice for doing this. Mr. Dibbs of Hawkwind singing and bass playing fame, and also Liam Sifrin, apologies if I've mispronounced that, suggested John Lydon, who would probably do a pretty interesting version of Sonic Attack. You'd suggested Michael Burke in a bid to be authentic to the whole idea of Sonic Attack as a public service announcement. There were three people, Jones the Boat, Liam Bones, but the first of which was Scott Owen, who actually, I think, came out with the winner for this, which is a man called Patrick Allen. He's in some movies I really like. He was around that kind of Hammer scene, and he co-stars with Christopher Lee in The Devil Rides Out, which is where I know him from. But he was the actual voiceover for the Protect and Survive material that was put out. So the actual genuine article of, nuclear war is coming, put a sheet over a table, that will save you, kind of stuff. So I think Patrick Allen, as the originator of the material of which Sonic Attack is a pastiche, is kind of inspired.
I think that's cool. I think very differently, but something I was thinking about was if I was to do a version of this in a contemporary way and try and freak people out, I think I wouldn't actually use a person. I was thinking it would be interesting to see how this would sound using that TikTok AI voice, the one that reads what you put over your videos.
Yeah.
I feel like having that kind of overly excited sounding American-ish female vocal over the top of something, and then you could like play with it. You could make it maybe like change in pitch or timbre or something, and like make it fall apart as well. I feel like if you were going to communicate a Sonic Attack to a lot of people at once, then something like TikTok or an Instagram reel would be a good way of doing it. So I like the idea of taking a very contemporary form.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that. I like that a lot. A couple of other things on this actually is that I rewatched 2010, the follow-up that nobody asked for to 2001, but I really like it. But there is the next version of HAL 9000, which is Sal, and Sal has a kind of whispery female voice with very hard consonants, with that very dispassionate tone that HAL has. That would be amazing. But also through voice cloning, which is where an AI learns to use a voice by learning from recordings of a voice, you could actually record this in the voice of, say, a Patrick Allen or a Marky Smith, people who are not around anymore, because there's enough recordings of their voice to do it. So, scarily, all these things are possible. Thanks to everybody who responded to that. That was hilariously good fun, reading the responses. Barry White was another one, which would be hilarious.
Barry White would just be like, if you're making love, just carry on, it's fine. In fact, everyone should be doing that. Everyone should just be making love.
That would be, it would be 10 minutes of everybody making love and no minutes of death and destruction.
The most positive version.
Yeah, totally. I love that. That's the kind of Sonic Attack the world needs right now. We also heard from people on a number of different things. We got a fabulous email, which actually is quite a long time ago now, but it shows the gap that we had between episodes. It's an email from a Mr. Paul Coward, who sent us one of those long emails that goes into his Hawkwind history and how his mum used to bring records back from the library from the 50p sell-off section and things like that. The stuff we love to read. But he starts off his email by saying, "Gentlemen, as with one of your previous correspondents, I stumbled across your podcast on Spotify after searching for Hawkwind in the hope that someone might have put a podcast together." So bingo there, Paul. He says, "As a lifelong Hawkwind fan, I'm mightily impressed with what you are doing. I love the format. The length of the podcast is perfect to do each album justice. Thanks very much for that." He then says, "It's fascinating hearing someone discovering a great album for the first time, and something I often wish I could do. Nothing beats bringing home a new release, which turns out to be a future classic, and having your mind blown." So we're hoping that happens this time for Matt with Choose Your Masques. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So we will see. And Matt, we've got some more emails as well, right?
Yes, Andy, we had an email from a Mr. William Fife who said that he's been following since episode 1, so an OG, and he sent us some clips of John Glenn, who was the astronaut that Hawkwind sampled in the Phenomenon of Luminosity on Church of Hawkwind. I remember suspecting it might have been a submarine or something like that, but it sounded real and didn't sound performed, and it was. It was John Glenn high in Earth orbit aboard the Friendship 7 in 1962. And William actually mentioned something interesting about Angel Voices, the track that I was trying to figure out why it might be called that. He said it could be a nod to the radio sci-fi series broadcast in the early 80s that was called Earth Search by James Follett. He says he remembers hearing a snatch of it, and there were characters called Angels 1 and 2, which were the featured spaceship control computers. And that would make sense considering that it does sound like someone talking to a computer. So maybe it is based on this Earth Search thing. So I might have to hunt that out and see whether or not that is true, because if it is, then I never would have got that. But yeah, a potentially deep cut pop cult reference there from Hawkwind.
Nice, and it's always good. It adds to the depth of these things when you know where they come from, so that's cool. We got some things on Twitter as well. Before the release of the Church of Hawkwind episode, we did tweet the fact that we'd finished recording it, to which Paul responded, "Don't give anything away, but it's bad news, isn't it?" Which just made me laugh. Hopefully you have your answer now, Paul. Jones the Boat, aforementioned for his suggestion of Patrick Allen, he said of the Church of Hawkwind episode, "Enjoyed that. Pretty much verbalised how I felt on its release. Fondue has bugged me for 40 years, precisely for the reasons you give." So it's fantastic to know that it's not just me and Matt who have endured the fondue. I thought Matt would balk more at the frequent fade-ins and outs, and as Matt suggested, he's now not angry, just disappointed when these things happen. And a nice message from Mark P. Bridges, who said, "Not sure how you've done it, but I'm ploughing through your podcast and re-listening to albums whilst at the same time questioning your podcast style like you question the music. I guess that's a compliment, so thank you." We're definitely going to take it as a compliment, because we'll take pretty much anything anybody says as a compliment, unless specifically it isn't. But I love the fact that you're listening to the podcast and re-listening to the albums, because that's really what it's all about. So thanks for that, and welcome aboard, and I hope you're managing to stay with us.
I'm just surprised that we have a podcast style.
Indeed. We've had some post-baggery on YouTube as well, have we not?
Yeah, I found it kind of interesting that some people leave comments the size of the kind of emails we get on YouTube, which is called. Most YouTube comments are like 1 or 2 words, but we get entire thought pieces, which I really enjoy. Rick commented on the Church of Hawkwind saying, "Oddly, when I first heard Church of Hawkwind, I loved it. I thought it was a magical breakthrough where the band was finally bringing a level of synthesizer sophistication their space rock deserved," which, yeah, I really agree with. I think that Hawkwind, for me, since the jump, has been a synth band, or at least a band which is trying to incorporate this kind of future music. And I do like the fact that they've never got bored of it or tried to move too far away from it. Even things like Levitation is still very much in there. So I'm glad you really liked it. Tony Crosby also mentioned that he just installed a hi-fi system in his son's room, who's 21. He's been asking for recommendations from him for vinyl. So he said, "Here, son, here's Live Chronicles and my ultimate favourite Quark. Have a bash at them. Here's hoping I've passed the baton on." So, Tony, if you are listening, do let us know what he thinks of them, because it would be really interesting to know what another generation thinks about listening to this for the first time. I can only imagine the references and the the musical bedrock that someone who's 21 will have come up on. I was closer to this music being the age I am, where someone who's 21 will have had a whole other generation of not listening to that stuff potentially. So yeah, that would be super interesting. We can do like a Hawkbinge Junior version at some point.
Yeah, the reboot with the different cast. I like it.
Lastly, Darren Evanson said, "Another splendid dissection of an album that can divide fans for me," but he agrees that it's a technological gem. He says Brock and Bainbridge dived into the new sounds that Korg synth offered, and the clever use of samples really added to the ambience. So yeah, I think a lot of people taking this album in the spirit of experimentation that it was. And yeah, I'm glad that people were able to get something out of it and see how some of these experimentation pieces then made it into the album we're about to talk about, because I feel that there is definitely a foundation of that in this. But the new album obviously does it in a much more Hawkwind conventional way, which is really good.
Absolutely. And we got a few messages on some Facebook groups. We don't exist as Hawkbinge on Facebook, but we're in a few Hawkwind groups, and more of these seem to turn up by the day. Hawkwind fandom stretches much further and much wider than anyone would think. But Wayne Jeffries, he said that he liked the R&D idea that we used as a way to frame the album. He said it's a really good way of looking at this album, and I think the conclusions you guys reached have pretty much nailed it. I enjoyed the podcast, so thanks for keeping on listening, Wayne. We also did drop the PDF of the booklet, and we included the original watercolours for the booklet by a man previously known only as Tim, but now known to the world as the Nick Randalls that he actually is. And Ash just said, "Very good to see the watercolour versions. Thanks to you and Tim for sharing them." So Nick, if you're listening, people have appreciated that, and we appreciate you letting us have those to put out. We also kind of announced ourselves on two fan groups that we hadn't known existed before, which is History of Hawkwind and the Hawkwind Music and Times. We've kind of been around Hawkwind and related album history, which is Brian Pitkin's group, and Hawkwind Fans Worldwide, which is the community from which Elric Newby's book is drawn, for a while. But we didn't know the other two, so we introduced ourselves on there and put links to where you can get hold of the podcasts, etc. And on one of those threads, Mr. Alan Price was very enthusiastic in suggesting that everybody who saw that post should check us out. So thanks very much, Alan, for that. It's always nice when people are passing on the podcast to others independently. That's really good to see. And then on the other one, Joe Banks just suggested that we were highly recommended. And being highly recommended by the man who wrote such a brilliant book on Hawkwind, that's really nice for us. So thanks to everybody. Hope we're getting a few new listeners in there, passing it on to other people or reconnecting with the music that they love.
It's great that Joe Banks still highly recommends us despite our egregious errors.
Yes, indeed.
He's like the lifeguard of the podcast, just telling us when we're in the deep end when we shouldn't be.
Exactly. So it's great to still have Joe around the podcast. And if you are listening to the podcast and you are enjoying what you hear, please, if you can spare the time, give us a rating, put a review in. We love to see them. It's not the easiest thing because you have to go out of your way to do it. And there's only a couple of places where you can. Apple is one, Spotify is another. But they do help in our attempts to connect with new audiences, bring Hawkwind to new ears, or to perhaps lapsed Hawkwind ears and bring them back into the fold. So please, if you can, put a few stars in. That would be much appreciated. And on that note, it is time to re-enter the world of 1982. So here we are back in 1982, and usually we set the scene for the musical environment in which a Hawkwind album is released by going through the major album releases of 1982. But obviously we did that on the last episode with Church of Hawkwind because we were in 1982 already. But we do want to get our heads back into 1982 to understand what the musical landscape was like when Choose Your Masques came out. So here's a few bands that formed in 1982, which kind of gives us a view of what's coming. Aha and Alien Sex Fiend, Coil, who have a bit of a link some decades down the line. Corrosion of Conformity, who I've seen at Desert Fest, formed in 82, which is a surprise. Ronnie James Dio leaves Black Sabbath and forms his own band. Kajagoogoo, remember them? Huge hair, are in 82. Mr. Nitzer Ebb, Primal Scream, Psychic TV, and Swans all form in 1982.
As in Swans?
As in Swans, apparently.
Wow, I have a lot of Swans. They're very cool. I think one of the last gigs I ever saw before I left London was Swans up in Islington. That was a great set.
Totally. Yeah, amazing band. And some brilliant people have been through that band, done their own things as well. So, yeah, great one to check out. 82 is apparently when they begin. 82 is an eventful year for Ozzy Osbourne. He bites the head off a bat, which he thought was rubber. He urinates on the Alamo and is somewhat censured by the Americans. He marries Sharon, and sadly, Randy Rhoads, his guitarist, is killed in an air crash that year. Only the 2 albums Randy Rhoads was on, but what an impact he made. That means that it is 40 years since the passing of Randy Rhoads, so definitely thinking of him and his legacy, but that's quite some year for Ozzy Osbourne. It is the year that the film of The Wall comes out. The Who begin a farewell tour, the only one they publicly announce as a farewell tour. Duran Duran's Rio, we talked about being released, it's on the charts for 2 years. So we're really entering the era of Duran Duran. Blondie break up at that point. Obviously, they've come back since. The Jam make their last TV appearance on the first episode of The Tube. And The Tube is something I very much grew up with. Jules Holland and Paula Yates. So that really sets the tone for me. It's the final ABBA single, obviously until very recently. And it's the year that Queen released Hot Space, which was absolutely panned because it's kind of their disco-infused album at the height of the disco backlash going on in the US. So that's what 1982 looks like. Here are a few number 1 singles on both sides of the Atlantic that happened in 1982. And if these don't place you in 1982, then nothing will. 1982 is the year of Don't You Want Me by the Human League. Town Called Malice and Beat Surrender by The Jam, The Model by Kraftwerk, The Lion Sleeps Tonight by Tight Fit, Ebony and Ivory by Macca and Stevie Wonder, House of Fun by Madness, the musical Crime Against Humanity that is Come On Eileen by Dexy's Midnight Runners, Eye of the Tiger in the States by Survivor, I Can't Go For That, No Can Do and Man-Eater by Hall & Oates, Abracadabra by the Steve Miller Band, and you have to say that slowly, otherwise it sounds like Steve Miller Band, like a lost brother from Labour Party leadership, and Mickey by Tony Basil with that famous cheerleader dance routine. So all of that should very firmly place you all back into 1982. So where are Hawkwind? Well, they've released Choose Your Masques, and they're doing a whole load of live shows. And they haven't yet hit the studio to record Choose Your Masques. And Nick Turner resurfaces. He plays a gig with them at Stonehenge. And in her superb book, The Saga of Hawkwind, Carol Clark says this of this momentous occasion. Dave Brock says casually of this momentous event, when you're doing all these festivals, invariably we'd bump into Turner. And he'd come and jam with us. He's always doing festivals. We probably asked him to come up and play with us. Nick did indeed take the stage with the band at Stonehenge, and he would become a permanent fixture in Hawkwind for more than 2 years. However, he wasn't involved in the sessions for their next album except for a little guest flute playing. So Nick's back, plays on the tour, doesn't really do anything much on the album, but then he's with the band for the next couple of years while they tour it. And Nick Turner is not the only person returning to the fold. As she says, concept king Michael Moorcock was back in the fold, writing both the title track and Arrival in Utopia, although he was credited as Steele, the maiden name of his wife Linda, probably for publishing reasons. She goes on to say, Michael Moorcock in his interview also contended that the concept he'd worked up for Choose Your Masques became diluted as work continued. It was the idea of people wearing masks to hide their real selves, but in the end, there wasn't much of that left. Dave made the final selection, and he had some other songs he wanted to put on it. So Choose Your Masques starts out as something of a concept album, and the people who go into the studio to record it are Dave Brock, Harvey Bainbridge, Hugh Lloyd Langton and Martin Griffin. This is the same lineup 3 albums running, and you can't help but think that something must be chronically broken in Hawkwind for the same people to still be in the band for 3 straight albums. It's recorded from June and July at Rockfield again, and released on October the 29th. And reaches number 29. So it's the lowest charting position of these 3 albums on RCA. It is the last album that they record on RCA. They are not retained on that contract after this. So this little RCA period of Sonic Attack, Church of Hawkwind and Choose Your Masques is quite a little self-contained era in the band. It also marks the end of the road for Martin Griffin, because he's the drummer, and on this album you can probably hear in the production there's actually quite a lot of drum loops and drum machines going on. And this is what Martin Griffin says of his time at this point, and this again is in Carol Reed's book. The recording sessions were, meanwhile, running into an ordeal for Martin Griffin. He had been led to believe that there would again be a lot of jamming in the studio, leading to the same sort of creative possibilities that had produced Psychosonia on Sonic Attack, which had been produced by Ashley Howe with Pat Moran and Paul Cobbold re-engineering. But the atmosphere had changed, he said. We had a different producer who was less enthusiastic about that kind of thing. I got on really well with Ashley Howe, who worked on the previous albums, but I don't think Pat Moran, producing with Hawkwind, really liked me very much. A lot of material was coming in pre-recorded with drums, either to be overdubbed or looped, and frankly, that's not my bag. So he recorded the album and then parted company with the band. And, you know, there is definitely something of a 80s production sounds to the album that we'll probably get into, but it does show a little bit of a shift perhaps in the way that the band are recording. So with that, it's time to see which mask Matt is going to put on as he plays this album.
If this is the last album that Hawkwind put out on RCA, I would say they've definitely gone out with a bang. I've had a lot of fun listening to this album, and not just because we had an overextended time with Church. In that case, anything after Church would probably have been good, but being able to listen to this objectively, I think it's very strong. I like the return to a feeling of dystopian sinisterness, which is throughout the whole thing, and even if it's maybe not as concept heavy as Mr. Moorcock would have wanted, I have felt that there's lots of themes about dreams, about reality, about looking towards the future, you know, which are recurrent themes that Hawkwind have got, but I feel like it is definitely present in this album. Not necessarily in a I'm going to beat you over the head kind of way, but certainly in a way where you feel like, oh cool, this theme's coming up again. And I feel like they address it in different ways in order to keep it interesting. I feel like they've been able to co-opt the 80s style in this to fit them. You know, there's lots of stories that blend with the music to create this kind of sense of drama, which I feel like is very 80s. Like in the 70s, I feel like the stories were much more in the foreground and the music was kind of there to accentuate it. But then when you get things like Levitation, the music has clearly come to the fore. And I feel like in this one, there's a nice balance between story, singing and music. So I do feel like we've got this nice equilibrium here, which I think makes the album very nice to listen to, both for your ears sonically, but also again for your brain to listen to what they're actually trying to say. There's some really nice experimental offerings in this that I do really vibe with. There's definitely some things here where I feel like, oh, that could be the start of like a whole thing, knowing where music goes that we'll pick up on, I'm sure. But certainly, while I can't say that the letter of the experimentation from Church of Hawkwind is in this, I feel like the spirit of it is. I can't really hear something from Church and go, oh, they brought that into this album. But the idea of noodling more with electronics, that idea of like, what can we make these things do, is probably the first time in a couple of tracks that I feel like Hawkwind have really started to experiment with what I call ear candy, those kind of little sonics which are around, which just complement the piece, and they're almost like a bit of pepper or spice on top without needing to be there. It's really great when it is. And the whole thing, comes together really nicely by being both experimental but also very complete, which I was worrying sometimes, experimental albums can run away with themselves and you're left a little bit, okay, well, that happened, which I guess is what Church did. But this, I feel like, keeps itself very much understanding that it's an album and behaves in the language and flow of an album. And it feels album length as well. It does feel like at the end of it, like I've experienced a whole album. When I saw Silver Machine was on this album, I was worried that it might lie on top of the album and smother it like a giant weighted blanket over all the other ideas. But actually, I don't think it's actually needed in this album for this album to be good. This isn't Silver Machine and an album. This is actually a great album that happens to have Silver Machine in it, which is really, really good. And I feel like in general, listening to this album has started to really cure me of my rather childish dislike of the 80s. 80s pop I'm still not a big fan of, but I'm not a big poppy guy anyway. But hearing this kind of band with the 80s filter and 80s production and stuff on it can be really good, and I shouldn't just ignore all of the 80s just because Dexy's Midnight Runners exists. But, you know, lots of sci-fi themes, general themes of looking towards the future. This feels like a Hawkwind vibe, and yeah, one of my favorite Hawkwind albums that we've come to so far, I think.
Wow, definite thumbs up from Matt so far. This is going to be a fun one because this is also one of my favourites. There are 2 or 3 tracks on here that would make an all-time top 20 Hawkwind list for me if I was doing one. So, yeah, well, let's come screaming out of the gate then with the title track, Choose Your Masques, which does not fade up.
It doesn't. Like you said, it's screaming in as a fully formed thought. And before we go into this, I just want to name check Alan Price again, who you mentioned on Facebook, because he said some nice things about us, but he did mention the only thing that drives me mad is Matt's dislike of most albums' first tracks. So I'm going to drive Alan nuts now by both liking and disliking this track at the same time. I like that we're straight into a riff and groove from the get-go. It's a bit like Levitation for me. It's just like, right, we've got somewhere to be. Let's get there really quickly. It feels like that kind of Levitation kind of thing. Like, yeah, let's just get straight to our point. But to talk on the music just for a moment, I love the simple groove of the riff. I love that it's low and growly. It kind of sounds like an idling engine or something. You know, there's something very like mechanical about it, with the drums picking out just enough time with a muted kick and snare, but it's letting the guitar really like do a lot of the talking. And this is the first time, again, when I talked about ear candy, this is the first time I heard that. They're kind of like little electronic kind of like modem sounds. I think they're really cool. I think it adds this sense of futuristicness from the get-go, but without the need for that sample and hold computer freak-out noises that we had in church. It reminds me of early Fear Factory or something, you know, that idea of combining guitars with that electric sounds. It's not really like another theme or a refrain. It's just there, like a sort of angry little inkjet printer or something in the background, which is really nice. I think it's great. It's very atmospheric and immediately just hooked me straight in. So I love that with a very small, subtle addition, they've been able to really like enhance the track immediately. I love the echoing and processing of the vocals. I really feel like that fits the spirit of the piece, you know, and again, it just integrates really nicely into the overall sound. And I love how the track builds. It goes from a strum to a kind of slide. It's the same riff and the same like rhythm, but there's just this little glide on the guitar. And as soon as that started happening, I can just immediately feel like my head nodding to it. And you feel like it's getting into its own steam, which is really nice. And every time I hear it, I'm always excited when that starts to happen. And again, that just complements the way that the whole track is mixed together. I think lyrically, it's okay. It's obviously referencing a story. The fact that Moorcock's involved makes it sound like this is probably one of his distillations of a book or a thought into a Hawkwind track. There's a couple of things in the whole track which stops me from enjoying it 100%. One of them I think is fair enough. The other one, everyone's going to hate me for because it's a very personal thing. I don't know why masques is spelt as it is, like masques. Is that the plural of masks? Is that not M-A-S-K-S? I don't know, but it looks a little pretentious, even if it's correct. Sorry. But also, I don't know why it needed to be masques, and it's the double assonance in masques, which is very distracting for me. I can just hear all the S's, and I can also hear my de-esser machine is going to have a field day with me talking about this when I edit the podcast. It reminds me of a Stuart Lee bit where he talks about crisps and the fact that there's a double assonance on crisps, and he does it on purpose to drive everyone nuts. I hear masks exactly the same way I hear crisps. And it could have been Choose Your Masque, as far as I can see in the story. Like, I'm only wearing one of these things. So I know it's like Choose Your Masques probably because we're talking to more than one person. But if you just talk to one person and said, choose your mask because it's going to affect you and everything you do, I feel like it wouldn't have affected anything. And the fact that there's that double assonance, I find kind of annoying for the reasons given. There's also a guitar fill about halfway through the track, which kind of goes da da da, and those are the first three notes in the 1980s Transformers TV show. And I get absolutely stuck on it because as soon as I hear that, I want to go da 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 da. And so that's only me that's going to do that too, but I can't get it out of my head. And to segue slightly, I remember when I was a child, I must have been like 11 or 12, maybe even younger. I don't remember. But my parents took me and my two brothers to Center Parks. I don't even know if that still exists. I assume it does. But it was, for anyone who doesn't know Center Parks, it was a kind of a resort, but under a dome. And their whole conceit was the weather can't spoil all your outdoor activities because everything's under this giant dome. It feels kind of dystopian Hawkwind somehow, like this domed civilization. But I got chickenpox during my time at Center Parks. Now I remember my parents and my brothers going and doing activities while I was stuck in bed feeling terrible. But all the little chalets that you stayed in had Sky TV, and we did not have Sky TV as a kid. And I remember being very unwell, full of chickenpox, itchy, scratchy, and miserable, but turning on Sky and there being a Transformers marathon. And I just watched hours and hours of Sky TV and Transformers, and it was, it's weirdly a formative memory of mine. So that TV show theme is very much in my brain and part of my life. And when I heard those three notes, I was immediately transported back to that, which is funny, but it just means that I then get distracted massively whenever I listen to this track.
Fair.
So that was a very large wandering around, meandering reason to why I find it hard to focus. Apart from that, I think it's a cool track. I think the story is not as compelling for me as maybe it is for other people or people who enjoy the books. I think, again, it's fine. And it's a good opening track in terms of like setting yourself out for what the rest of the album is going to be. But yes, it's one that I cannot connect with 100%. For me, it's like a good 6 out of 10 Hawkwind track. I don't hate it, but certainly there are some things that bother me.
So I love this track. To address one thing first, masque with a Q is the kind of mask that you would wear at a masquerade.
Okay.
Hence the masquerade, so different type of mask. And on the back of the album cover, those are the kinds of masks that you see. When I didn't know that, which I wouldn't have known it when I first bought the album, I just kind of liked the air of mystery to a degree that kind of creates.
Yeah, if you don't know the story, you could assume this is almost a metaphorical mask. Yeah. The idea of like putting something on that's invisible because you have to choose a side and it represents a part of you, or it represents maybe your destiny or what you're choosing to do, which again, we had a lot of that in the last Hawkwind album, that idea of like destiny and fate. So yeah, I feel like you can extrapolate a meaning out of it, which is good. You don't need to exactly know what's going on.
It comes in so suddenly that it almost feels like it comes in halfway through a bar. But I love that. I love the riff. And I actually really like the lyrics in this. I love the fact that it's this chaos and law thing, which is a very Moorcock thing. It's part of his multiverse, part of his books. You are about to have to learn an awful lot more about that, given where we're about to go after this. So you may reflect on this, funny enough, after the fact in future episodes. But I think Dave delivers it with really strong vocal as well. His voice is great in this. And it's got a really good, powerful, driving feel to it. So, I'm always excited to put this on and this be the first track, and I'm immediately launched into it. So this is one of my favourite Hawkwind tracks, and the whole thing works really well for me. I know what you mean when you hear something and it reminds you too much of something else and is distracting, because I've found that with some recent music I've heard where there's a really good song. It's a really nice song. It's actually on the Porcupine Tree album. But there's a 3-note guitar riff, which is the exact same 3-note guitar riff as exists on a Stone Temple Pilots track. And I need to listen to the Porcupine Tree track a whole lot more so that becomes the default setting for where that 3-note guitar riff goes, if you see what I mean. I'll have had this one cemented in my head enough that my brain will go in its direction. That's what you'll need. You'll need to play Choose Your Masques in your sleep so that it imprints itself, so that's where your head goes when you hear that little 3-note riff. So we're off to a strong start, or a strongish start, when we head into something very, very different. And before I hand this over to you, there's something that Ian Abrams says in his excellent book, Hawkwind Sonic Assassins, which kind of goes back to the theme that we had about Choose Your Masques, where Harvey Bainbridge talks about Church of Hawkwind. We described it as a kind of album of R&D, as a kind of mixtape. And in Ian's book, Harvey says of the LP, that it was a staging post for Bainbridge's own interest in electronica, providing a more inventive outlet for his synthesizer work, removed from the grungy live Hawkwind sound. When he comes back to Choose Your Masques and Harvey Bainbridge, whose track the next one is, we have this from Harvey Bainbridge. "I was in the studio just playing with a synthesizer," says Bainbridge. "I started at home with a backwash of stuff. I had a bass guitar riff that I wanted to use over this, a sort of ambient sound. I played it, we recorded it, and I didn't like the results. So out of interest, I said, could we see what it sounded like backwards? And the riff sounded much better, so we used that. The number was included in most Hawkwind sets throughout the 80s, constantly changing and evolving. I thought it had just got to the right feel when we got to in 1989, though when I listened to the Choose Your Masques version played to me recently on a brilliant hi-fi system, it sounded very exciting." So there you can see where some of Church of Hawkwind has directly bled in to Choose Your Masques, and the track Dreamworker.
When I first heard this, I thought, okay, this is now Hawkwind going into some serious experimentation. As far as I can see from the iTunes track listing, the last track doesn't blow up. This track actually blows in. So we actually start with the bang. I don't mind it as a scratch for the last track because I don't really know how else you'd resolve one into the other because they're so very different. I think it's good to see that Hawkwind are carrying on their sampling tricks that they started with Church into this album. I think it adds an extra layer of texture and interest to the piece. I think what I love about samples is that you can grab them out of context and just replay them in their new context and can completely change things. You know, they are very evocative then for the listener as much as it is trying to figure out where they originally came from. So I think they work on lots of levels. I think it becomes, this fun talking point to try and figure out where things are from. Like the fact that we now know the phenomenon of luminosity is a John Glenn sample. It's really interesting that that's what you grab. And, you know, the role of almost a sample curator, the idea that you could sample anything. So what is the thing that you find? What is always interesting to see what people choose to put where. And I think it's a very appropriate sample that we have in this. Compared to something like Angel Voices, this is an atmospheric piece that really hits home. I feel like the atmosphere is much richer. It draws you in with much more low drones. I feel like the mixing is really nice. Everything's very tight despite being kind of very flowy. The kind of radio play style vocal at the beginning feels more corrupted and distorted, which adds character compared to Angel Voices. You know, like what it's saying is much more vague and less blurred in the sci-fi nonsense, so it feels more relatable. It stirs the imagination more because, you know, there's still some very sci-fi terminology like orbital status now maintained and target zone vectors locked in, which is so much sci-fi nonsense. But when it just says the tube, suddenly I have to imagine the tube. And that then means that I start to think about it. You know, it's not off-putting language, which I can't deal with. It's a whole visual picture that I can figure out. And the idea of the blue dreamer sounds vague and evocative. I almost feel like someone's taking some kind of pill and then going down one of those giant water luges. That's where I get. But also, it feels like it's kind of an internal thing, or maybe like one of those sensory deprivation tanks or something you're going into in order to do some kind of thing with dreams, because obviously we're called Dreamworker, but also we have this blue dreamer, which again, I wasn't sure if that was part of a story or anything, but even so, not being aware of it, if it is, I can see it being this kind of thing that you take or something that's applied to you in order to make something happen in your brain or maybe in the brain of someone else. So I think there's some nice ideas in there already. Even the computer thinking sound is more integrated into the sound bed, so that's much less annoying. So yeah, I feel like in terms of them taking some of that experimentation and turning it into something which sounds a lot more complete and a lot more done on purpose, then this absolutely is. The main vocal is delivered almost like Psychosonia from Sonic Attack. So I assume that's the same guy, the same kind of like shouty singing in that.
Yeah, that's Harvey.
Yeah, right. So yeah, it feels like you just read, it's his piece and his idea, and that kind of shouting being recessed into the mix, so it becomes this strange, almost incomprehensible element in this kind of sonic miasma is interesting. I had to look up the lyrics to make sure I knew what he was saying because I couldn't really get it otherwise, but I kind of liked that. It's that idea of like snatch vocals, which again, I feel like is kind of dreamy. I feel like the sonic nomenclature for dreams is normally things sounding a bit weird. You can't quite grasp them. Normally things are quite slow. So I do feel like this is definitely fitting into the dream state. The things sounding reversed, I wasn't sure whether or not it was reversed or whether or not they were playing a synth with a very low attack. Because if you ramp up the attack of a attack, decay, sustain, release envelope, it can sound like it's going backwards. So I wasn't sure if they were doing a very like exponential curve or playing backwards. But I definitely heard that. And again, that feels very dreamy. It feels very different to what you'd expect. So that's when you feel like you're going into sound design rather than like quote unquote music. Like the last track was very musical. This one is definitely a big audio soup for us to get lost in. I can't say with certainty that I've worked out what this piece is all about. I feel like it is deliberately disorientating, which I don't mind, but I also like the fact that it's being deliberately ambiguous, because I feel like, again, that is part of the point of the piece. The fact that there's that lyric, "the dreamers turned you round," makes it sound like maybe we're not wanted where we are. Maybe we're invading someone's dream. Maybe this is a bit Inception-y and maybe like they're fighting us. The fact that we're called dream worker, it almost makes me feel like how a metal worker is a job. You know, like you take metal and you work it to make something. If you're a dream worker, is it like your raw material is dreams? And you're using human consciousness as a crafting material, which I thought was kind of interesting. It then kind of reminds me of the book Neuromancer, in the same way that with Pyromancer, the idea of manipulating fire, you're a mancer or something. So the idea of Neuromancer, you're controlling people's minds. I felt like, you know, it takes me into that kind of idea where we get like ideas of Matrix, we get ideas of Ghost in the Shell. So I feel like this is very relevant to Hawkwind, absolutely. So I feel like, yeah, just at the end of the track, I'm left with just enough information to keep my mind busy, but without enough clarity to feel like I fully get the intended message, if there was a message at all. It's not a confounding experience. It's something that's very different. It'd be interesting actually to hear from you in a second whether or not you'd heard anything like this before you listened to it, because for me, I have lots of records in this style. You know, I like it a lot. You know, like my last turntable pick, I picked Hollywood Medieval, which is very much like this, that idea of like musique concrète, that idea of taking samples and loops and making things that last a very long time. And it almost feels like they haven't gone anywhere for the 10 or 20 minutes they're on until you take the pin of the record and move it along the record. And then you realize that actually it's changed quite a lot. So this is quite familiar to me, but I can imagine maybe in the early 80s this was a bit weirder. But I love that Hawkwind has messed with this in this kind of way. So I'd love to know what you thought of this when you came at it with less of a musical history that you have now.
I loved it from the first time I heard it. It's soundscapey, so I never really known what the track was about. I never really analysed what was being said. It's just that the words were synced beautifully with the soundscape to kind of help take your mind somewhere. This could be 20 minutes long for me and I would go with it, because in fact it kind of puts you under a little bit of a spell and you go with it. And it's over all too quickly. Number of times I've heard this track and then I've had to go back and hear it again because actually I've drifted with it and then had to kind of snap back with it. And I found it confusing from trying to piece a story together, which is probably why I didn't, because I learned where the first clip had come from is Ian Holm being Frodo Baggins in the BBC radio drama version of Lord of the Rings, being that point when he reaches Mount Doom with the ring and then can't throw it in and Gollum bites his finger off. That just sounds really quite evil and cryptic. And I kind of thought, okay, I'm not sure how that blends with everything else, but I don't really care because it's atmospheric and evocative and it works with the music. And I love the sounds that they use. And as a contrast to Choose Your Masques, I think it's really powerful, that kind of 1-2 punch of taking you somewhere completely different from where the first one was. And I love that. So I've always loved this track. And I think to your point of me coming at this without having heard too much of this before, it foreshadows things I got into afterwards. I think it showed that I was going to be very receptive to this kind of music and pick this kind of thing up in other bands. Even bands like King Crimson, for example, where I'd started out liking the songs, I ended up liking all of the really weird, abstract, improvisational stuff that they would do later. So yeah, in that sense, definitely a sign of things to come for me in my love of this track, and I like it just as much now as I did back when I first got the album. And at the end of this track, we go straight back into something with real power and energy and arrive in Utopia.
Yeah, like Choose Your Masques, we are right into the track, aren't we? Which is, again, a bit like the first track. It's instantly groovy. I feel like it's quite a classic rock groove on the drums with a big growly guitar laying down a very animated bottom end and a kind of sparse but very flowing soloish lead at the top, setting this sonic scene for something fun to happen. I feel like as soon as I heard this, I was like, this is going to be fun. You can immediately feel like they're animated and excited about what they've got. There's an immediate vibe, and the vocals come in quick to pick up what the music's laid down, and I really like the vocals in this piece. The whole thing is really nicely delivered. There's a great rhythm to the lyrics. You know, it's delivered in this chorus that adds to the energy of the piece. It does sound like there's at least two people singing at the same time, or they've layered it. It's not really like a harmony, but again, it just sounds like a chorus of people, which they've done before and to great effect. And I think the vocals is great in both content and delivery. The theme of dreaming is present, like we just had in the previous track, but this time it's like full on space rock instead of like space ambience. So there's this cryptic, dark, ambient piece before, which then explodes out into this piece. I love Days of Wine and Nights of Fire. I think that's a great line. Dogs that talk like boys is a very weird line. So there's a mixture of things that are great and things that are bizarre. But the story itself is really interesting. You know, someone's rejection of the idea of utopia, which is supposed to be the ultimate goal of civilization in theory. And, you know, that is something being seen as boring and pacifying without excitement or danger, gives you this bored, mindless lyric that we have, which is, I think, an interesting idea that, you know, while we strive for it, utopia may be something that we should never maybe achieve, because it actually ends up being not what we actually want. We want it in theory, but we don't want it in practice. And, you know, it's never really been a core theme of literature or songs, has it? It's more of a point of contrast. You know, like in a film or a story, sometimes if a place is in a state of utopia, it surely won't be, and that will be the drama. It's normally that kind of accident or tragedy that raises the stakes. You know, no one's ever normally singing about everything is great and everything is fine, because that wouldn't be an interesting thing.
No, exactly. Or there's some kind of villain behind the scenes and really it's not utopian. So you never get a genuine utopia in which people go, this is horrible, isn't it?
Exactly. Even like, you know, The Matrix goes into that idea where the first version of The Matrix was a utopian fantasy, but we as humans rejected it as viscerally false. So they had to make one like real life, which obviously made the effects budget great because they could just film real life. But I think there's an interesting idea about the fact that the machines tried to give us what we wanted and we actually found we didn't want it.
Yeah.
There's a philosopher called Robert Nozick. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. But in 1989, he posited this thought experiment called the experience machine, which was this idea of there's a machine and you go into it, either like a needle goes into your head or there's a screen in front of you, or however it works in a way that suddenly you're transported into your ideal world that feels completely real. The machine even removes the memory that you even entered the machine. So in your experience, it'll feel so totally real that you can be whatever you want. If you want to fly, you can fly. If you want to be a billionaire, you can be a billionaire. If you want to live on the moon or whatever, you can just do that and it'll feel so real. But he posits at the end of his writing that no one would actually get into the machine, even if it would erase their memory of doing so, precisely because of that reason, that people feel like they're betraying their real self. Even if it's an amazing gilded cage, it's still a cage. And so I feel like that's a super deep point that I only read about recently and was only really written about academically in 1989 as far as my cursory research has gone. But, you know, the fact that they're talking about this in 82 is really interesting. I love this thought, this story again. This is a very great Hawkwind style story of being bored in paradise. It's again got that great dissonance between what you expect and what is occurring. With that lyric about talking dogs, you'd have thought maybe a land of talking dogs might be something you'd never get bored of. But clearly, even that isn't interesting.
Well, perhaps they don't have much to say.
Which is exactly the passage from the book, The Knife of Never Letting Go. Have you read that?
No.
Oh, that's hilarious, because there's a line in the book, The Knife of Never Letting Go, which is by Patrick Ness, which says, the first thing you find out when your dog learns to talk is that dogs ain't got much to say, which is an amazing thing. So maybe, unfortunately, utopian talking dogs are really boring because they're just running around going like, hungry, hungry again, scratch please. And you're like, I wanted to have a conversation. They're like, what? No, feed me. Damn it. So yeah, maybe the talking dogs was the last straw in a utopian dream. I think that's a great idea, and it's given us lots to talk about, which is fantastic. It's what I always look for and love when I hear a new Hawkwind track like this that we can do. But I also think the music works to raise this from good track to great track level for me. My personal highlight is when the solo comes in after the chorus. Halfway through the solo, there's a key change, which is immensely satisfying. Every time that hits, I'm just like, yes, that's exactly what I wanted. And I feel like the solos throughout this whole album are really deftly done. They're a bit 80s, but not over 80s. They have that howling, screaming aspect to them, but they have a sparseness to them which never overshadows the rest of the music. I really feel like whoever's playing guitar is able to pick out key notes which then layer on top rather than completely overshadow. It's not like someone who's just doing mad finger picking to show off. That guitar is always there to just add this extra layer and point of interest, and it does a really great job of moving the whole thing along. Also, in terms of sound design and ear candy, there's this amazing spectral metallic scraping sound after the solo, which sounds amazing. It sounds like someone like running a knife over a dish or something. This kind of like kind of sound, which if you just put that over like a 90s drum and bass sample, you'd have a track. I think there's something really glorious to that. I don't know how they've achieved that sound, but again, for me, that's that experimental sound and ear candy, which just adds to the interest of the track. To just criticize a little bit of it, I feel like the breakdown to just the drum kit at the end takes the energy away a little bit, and then bringing everything back in, it doesn't quite hit in the same way that I think they thought it would. It just feels like, oh yeah, now we've just brought everything back in rather than like, explode back. But, we're still good, and we go round the verse one more time and then we're done. It's a short, snappy, very sophisticated little track. I really, really like this one.
It hits on so many levels. You're absolutely right. Dave's double-tracked vocal, you don't hear that kind of vocal effect very often in Hawkwind, but it works beautifully here. And the lyric, again, it's Moorcock's other lyric after Choose Your Masques, really well thought out. And it's Hugh Lloyd-Langton on the guitar, and this is my favourite Hugh Lloyd-Langton guitar solo, by some way. I mean, he's an excellent guitarist, he's brilliant in Hawkwind, but this, you're right, he can play a lot of notes per second. He can do the Van Halen. But he doesn't do it very often. He'll do it to punctuate something, but then he'll go back to just laying the notes in that feel right to carry the song. And Hugh's guitar solo in this is not a space left for Hugh to show off, which I think is the case with a lot of guitarists in a lot of guitar solos, particularly in the 1980s. So yeah, this is a beautiful track, and what a run of 3 tracks this is to open any album. And yeah, it does the job very, very nicely and leads us to what on the original vinyl is the final track of side 1, which is again something of a change in pace with Utopia, where we have now arrived.
I feel like this is trying to say everything the previous track did, but just without lyrics. We've had rocky track, ambient track, rocky track, now another ambient track. The dissonance between the spookiness of the track and the title being Utopia tells us it's not the paradise we were promised. I feel like, yeah, we're kind of saying the same thing twice. I don't really understand quite why we've bothered to do that, but it's a nice track. I just feel like the idea was done so well in the previous track. We didn't necessarily need this to be called Utopia. It could have been called anything else, but let's look at it for what it is. I like the wind chime sounds and the warbling, pitch drifting atmospherics to set the mood. It feels very 80s horror movie, which again makes sense if we're trying to get that idea of unease from Utopia. Mm-hmm. It's not actually that long, but half the track is a sample of if you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it, which is a repetitious sample. I don't know where it's from. I wasn't able to source it. It sounds a bit Ringo Starr somehow, but I don't think it is. It's been processed in an interesting way, and I feel like if you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it, is exactly what the previous track was talking about. The fact that actually if you want Utopia, you can't be in Utopia, because as soon as you're in it, you'll reject it, or you'll find something wrong with it, or it's so perfect, you'll become suspicious or something. So Utopia is a dream you should never realize, and we should all strive for it because that makes everything better. But we need to be happy with the idea that we'll never actually reach it, because for some reason it's actually something that we as humans right now are not able to appreciate. Maybe in the future we'll learn to be okay with it, but sometimes there's that feeling of like, I guess we have this working in agency and stuff, sometimes like we've always had that guilt of going on vacation or something because there's work to be done and you're not doing it, and that I feel like that's the kind of utopian thing. If we made Utopia and then we stopped for a break, we'd feel weird about doing that. So I feel like Utopia needs to be built by people and then enjoyed by other people.
That's fair. I like that.
Yeah, that's the interesting idea, I think, for if you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. Why it sounds a bit like a dissonant idea, I think that's the deeper point behind it, but succinctly put into this little loop.
I was convinced that you would be really annoyed by how long that goes on for, but seemingly not.
I am and I'm not. I think it repeats more than it needs to.
Mm-hmm.
I quite like it as an idea. Again, I feel like it's quite experimental. It reminds me of when we went to the proms and we heard It's Gonna Rain,
Yep.
which is essentially that person saying it's gonna rain and then looped, but then recorded and phased, and it kind of moves all around the place. And it starts interesting, then it kind of gets a little bit annoying, and then it gets interesting again, then it gets annoying, and then it gets interesting. You know, this is almost like that, but light, because it's just doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But I'm a big house music guy. I listen to a lot of loops. I can listen to loops for ages. I feel like I could steal this and put a beat behind it and it would be the start of some kind of track. It would be kind of fun, you know, so I don't mind it. It feels a bit like Chemical Brothers somehow, that idea of taking something slightly mystic sounding and looping it for a bit. I feel like by the fourth repetition, I've got the point.
Yeah.
But I do feel like they're trying to do some kind of Philip Glassian thing with it. So it makes sense from a vinyl point of view.
Absolutely. 100%.
It reminds me a little bit of the Beatles. The Day in the Life was the last track on that album.
Yeah.
And then they actually put in the run out, which is, you know, what the pin goes into to just go round and round before you take the pin off. They put a little loop in that and it kind of goes, and it just goes round and round forever. Before you had removing automatic hi-fi record players that would take the pin off, it would just go round and round and round.
That's right.
And I was wondering whether or not this was like a locked loop. That's what you normally call those things. I was wondering if you want to get into it, you got to get out of it on a loop and just put that at the end of the record. That would be cool from a vinyl experience.
That'd be perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. I don't think that's what this is doing, but I think that's probably like the idea of it.
Exactly right. So I found that I was okay with it being the last track on side one of the album, because as the album run off, it's quite effective. And sometimes if I'm playing vinyl, you know, you don't wait for the vinyl to stop and then run over and pick it out. There's usually, you're doing something or whatever and you get up and saunter over at some point. So it's fine that goes on. It's a little bit like some of the stuff that you weren't keen on the very early albums when they would do the speeding up and slowing down thing. But when you start streaming it, then if you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. It goes on for much longer than you want it to, because you understand you're at the end of the track now and you want the next one to begin. So it's definitely a streaming issue rather than a musical issue. I love the chimes and stuff. And funny enough, this time round with the record, I heard that more than I'd heard it previously. I don't think I'd ever really taken that on board before with my previous passes of the album, but I really liked it. And the phrase, by the way, I think it sounds like an acid phrase to me. And it reminds me of Timothy Leary, turn on, tune in, drop out, something like that. And I think if you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. It sounds acidy to me, in the same way that a Blue Dreamer sounds very much like an acid tab to me. So I take it as being that. But yeah, I'm happy and slightly surprised. I thought you were going to like the chimey stuff, but then be annoyed. But you're right, you're into loops from different things. And I think conceptually you're into this album. Therefore, you have somewhat more leeway with this happening at this point of the album because you're going with it conceptually, which is a great thing.
If you put this track into the middle of Levitation, it would not work.
No.
But because Dreamworker has definitely set the stage for this to appear and work, it's just taking the weirdness and audio experimentation one step further. So I think it's completely justified in where it is. And yeah, I'm glad they did it and wanted to share it.
Cool. So side one is a pretty good package of 4 songs. It's as good a side as I can remember. There have been almost perfect sides of Hawkwind albums before. I'm trying to think back to Quark, for example, things like that. But this is up there for me with that side one. So we turn over the record and we are faced with Silver Machine. And I remember when we did our Silver Machine episode for the single, because obviously it was a non-album single, I know the track so well. Obviously, I thought you type in Silver Machine and you get Silver Machine. You typed in Silver Machine and you got this Silver Machine, which prompted you at the time to think that Hawkwind were years ahead of their time, but would have made for a very awkward podcast episode if you hadn't discovered this error and then gone back. So you've had a little bit of a glimpse into the future with this one before, and now here it actually is.
Here it is, yeah. I feel like from an album point of view, having this on the first side of side 2 is a great place for it. Silver Machine, in terms of a vibe, isn't quite the same as the rest of the album. I always feel like Silver Machine has always been a very uplifting, jammy track. I actually really like what they've done with it in order to bring it more up to date for the 80s, but also for it to work as well as it can into this album. I feel like this is almost like Hawkwind making up for the Live 79 version, because like the Live 79 version, it starts off with a very lively solo that I think is a great way of establishing this isn't your 70s Silver Machine. This is a new version. It's faster than the original, and I feel like the actual music is leading more than the original, which I feel was built very much on Lemmy's delivery. But of course, if you don't have a Lemmy, you do then need to change how the thing works. And I think Brock does a decent job of singing it, actually. I think recessing the vocals slightly helps the vibe of the whole thing. I guess because he's got the ability to sing in the studio, I think it works. I think the Live 79 version is a little bit raspy and kind of more like forced. It sounds a bit like he's out of breath. I feel like this one is a lot more confident, and I think you need to sing confidently to make those lyrics work, especially again when you're looking at arguably their most well-known track. I think the whole thing feels a little rushed. We dropped some lyrics in favor of more solos and noodlage and pinball machine sound effects. I miss The Other Side of the Sky. I like that lyric, and the fact it's not present in this one disappoints me a little bit, but it's fine. I can live with it. What I do like about this is that they drop into that minor dirgy riff at the end, which I like. I think it does a good job of integrating the track into the general vibe of the album and not letting the upbeat positivity and rockiness of Silver Machine take away from the core of the album. They pull it back to a more kind of classic upbeat riff at the end, but having that in the middle and being able to drop into it and out of it has a nice A-B section that the original didn't. So I feel like there's a lot more like musical thought maybe in this one. And yeah, I think it fits nicely into the album, where before I was worried that Silver Machine might be the turd in the punch bowl, you know, like how do you build an album around such an old track that everyone likes, you know, but I feel like they've done a really good update. I think they've taken it, they've shined it up, they've taken it apart and put it back together again. The one thing I wish that they hadn't done is fade out off beat. When they fade it out, the last line is, it's an electric line, and you could have just finished to your zodiac sign and just let it go out so it's on the 4, but it's not, and I feel like that's always slightly dissatisfying to me. But in general, I like what they did with it, and I don't think it is incongruous into the album. In fact, like we said, I don't think it needs to be on the album for the album to be good. It's certainly not the track that they dropped in to save a dying album. It's a track that I guess they put in because it is 10 years on and they wanted to do something with it. But it's funny how their attitude has changed after Live 79, blowing it up like, ugh, that track again, to actually then completely and quite lovingly recreate it a few years later is an interesting kind of story on that track itself. But yeah, I like it. It was like bumping into an old friend and seeing that they've done really well for themselves. you know, you've obviously like grown up and you've done some things and had some experiences, and it's nice to see you again.
Nicely put. I've now got the phrase "the turd in the punch bowl" in my head because I've not heard that before. It sounds like the children's book that no one should ever write. When I first heard this on the album, I really didn't like it. I kind of almost objected to it being there when I first got the album. Can't really say why, it just didn't really sit well. Coming back to the album for this episode now and playing an awful lot, I found I come to it very, very differently, and I don't mind it at all. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I love it, but I certainly don't mind it. It's certainly not a skipper. It's not one that I go, oh, no, not this. I actually can quite get into it now. I think Dave sings it really well in a way that he probably couldn't have sung it in 1972, because obviously I believe he tried to. It didn't really work. So yeah, it's a nice kind of upbeat, energetic version. For those of you listening who are saying it wasn't supposed to be on the album. Yep, we know, and we're going to come back to that. So patience on that one. But yeah, I quite like it. And you're absolutely right. This is the only place on the album you could really put it. Side 1 being as much of a package as it is, you want something that's completely fresh, that kind of cleans the slate completely, ready for side 2. And that feels to me what this does in the context of this album. So not too much to add. I think you've pretty much nailed it. It's something that I've definitely come round to, and leads us to a little track called Void City,
which I deeply dislike, but also like that it exists, because I feel like it's not fair for me to dislike it as much as I do because I'm listening to it in 2022. Probably in 1982, it was more experimental for them and maybe more experimental for the music. Although, like Kraftwerk and stuff are around at this time. So I feel like, I don't know. I'm trying to be generous with it, but I'm not a fan of it. It feels like Hawkwind may be pushing too far out of their comfort zone and doing what is a fairly toothless dance record without knowing or appreciating what makes a good dance record. I feel like it would be like me trying to write an opera. I give it a go, but anyone who likes opera will go, why is any of this happening? I like the fact they're experimenting. This is definitely a drum machine. This is definitely them playing with loops again. I feel like when they just do loops and stuff, it feels like we've gone back to church a bit. And this feels like it could have been on church for me. Opening with a sample is fine, but I feel like if you're going to open with such a classic sample like The Outer Limits and the whole thing, do something with it. But they just play it, and it even cuts just at the end in a really annoying way, just like, just fade it out or add some delay or echo or something, but it just cuts like they've just stopped the tape, and I'm like, oh, it's always such a lurch. And that was the only thing that was really holding any interest. So when it goes, you have this weak drum that's just like spitting along and this very nothing little like refrain that's being played, and you're just then kind of like just left with this plinky synth. We lose an entire dimension which it never really then is able to come back from, I don't think. There's some interesting stuff in terms of how they're playing with the drum machine. They have this snare which sounds like they're wave folding it or they're modulating it in some way because it has this pianging kind of sound, which I like, but again, that's not going to save the whole track. It's got a bit of playfulness to it. It's a little bit whimsical. It's crying out for a deeper bass line or a kick or something to work the bottom end somehow. That's kind of what this music's normally based around. It's based around something rhythmic, a bit more like primordial, a bit more basic, but in a great way. And this just isn't doing that. I just feel like, someone just accidentally turned the bass EQ down and forgot to turn it up again. Given the fact we've had things like Dreamworker, I find this is the strangest track we've actually had. It's also the longest, which really annoys me because I feel like this is a 3-minute idea and it massively overstays its welcome at being close to 6 minutes. Every time it comes on, I get into it a little bit, but I get tired of it. Way more than if you want to get into it, you got to get out of it loop. It's kind of nice to see them playing with vocoders with the Void City Here We Come, but it's a meh thing to say. It's delivered in a meh way. It starts to grate on me, and the last thing it does at the very end is have some kind of keyboard. It's not a solo, but it sounds like someone who has never touched a keyboard before is playing it. It sounds like they're just playing any note they can see. It sounds off time. It definitely sounds off key. It absolutely infuriates me. It sounds like such a bad sound as well. It sounds like Baby's first Casio. So I feel like they've found everything that would make me annoyed about a synthesizer and done it at the end. It actually kind of reminds me of John Benjamin's Well, I Should Have Learned to Play the Piano, which is comedian John Benjamin actually got a jazz ensemble together and just pounded the piano randomly. But because he does it with a kind of sense of humor and actually of timing, even though it's all wrong, it kind of works and it's kind of hilarious. And it's a whole album. It's worth checking out if anyone ever wants a very strange thing. I like to put it on at parties and wait to see if anyone notices, because it's a great way to see if anyone's paying attention to the jazz. But he has a sense of timing and playfulness where this feels like someone is just going, oh God, I've got a synth in front of me, help. And it's just like jabbing sporadically. So yeah, I think this track unfortunately has no redeeming qualities for me, and it became one that I did after I wrote my notes on it, actually started to skip it. Given everything we've had, it feels like a band's first effort. Yeah. I admire the effort, but I also never want to hear it again.
Weirdly, I don't dislike this anywhere near as much as you do. I can't really disagree with anything that you've said. It is far too long. It really needs to be half as long as it is. You're right, they should have done more with that quote at the beginning because it's such a quote. If you're going to use it, then really use it. And I wish they'd come up with something more profound than Void City, Here We Come. Because you don't mind the single phrase with the effects, but you need the phrase to be something that your mind can play with. And Void City, Here We Come is not. Curiously, the bit that you really hate at the end with the keyboard stabbing, I actually quite like that. And I think I quite like it simply because it breaks up what's come before. It's at least some new ingredient, which I think by that time it really needs. And what sounds like one of those simple little 2.5-minute things that we then come on and go, I wonder why they didn't turn this into a track. Well, they did turn this into a track, and they probably shouldn't have done. I don't mind it being on the album, but it's an interstitial, but it's the length of a track, if you see what I mean. So, yeah, no, I hear you. I think it could have been fantastic. They could have gone to town on this like they did with Dreamworker and made it into something really interesting, but they just kind of didn't. So that's Void City. And yes, strange item on the agenda that it is. But it leads us to something really interesting, which is Hugh Lloyd-Langton's first track on the album, which is Solitary Mind Games.
Which I did not see coming. First time I listened to this album, I was like, wow. The intro is spectacular. The synth sounds great. The top line is picked out so clearly in the mix over this like broody guitar bass line, and the reverb smears it all together wonderfully. There's some great undulating feeling in the effects here. When it first came on, I was like, have I accidentally gone onto a different album? Just because it's so different. Like, we've just had what I would call a fairly terrible synth experiment in Void City, and then for this to come in and make up for it, you're like, all is forgiven, Hawkwind. This sounds amazing. It feels like almost Hawkwind's become Depeche Mode before Depeche Mode was Depeche Mode. In terms of both the sound of the synth, but also in the delivery of the lyrics. You know, like, I can sing All I Ever Wanted, All I Ever Needed Is Here over this, and it sounds perfect to me.
Yeah, I'd never thought of that.
Yeah, it sounds great. It's beautifully atmospheric. The lyrical delivery is so fresh compared to what we've had before. I love the space where the lyrics aren't as much there. They kind of flow in and out. They have a delivery to them, you know, that it's not a Dave Brock shout. This is actually sung with earnestness. And we've had this a couple of times in Hawkwind, but not for a while. And I think that the atmospheric delivery of the lyrics really works nicely with the actual music that we have. We have some great lines as well. Everlasting grains of truth are gnawing at his brain is a fantastic line. And we've got everything we've had before. You know, we've got visions of dreams. We have visions instead of dreams, but I feel like visions and dreams, they're in the same ballpark, right? So I feel like it is similar thematically. We also have this idea of the future, which we had in Dreamworker, when we say you've reached your future state. In this, the idea of like, can the future mend? It has this idea of like hope for the future, but also maybe some trouble that they need to resolve. Solitary Mind Games as a title, I wonder if this is like that idea of overthinking things, maybe that idea of when you are by yourself, you can start to spiral out. Is it a bit like the Demented King? I feel like there's an interesting theme we've had before of the idea of someone who is full of self-doubt or is spiraling out by overthinking things, or not being in control of things. So I think tonally the lyrics and the music go together really, really nicely, and there's a really nice guitar solo-ish thing in order to round us out. I feel like the only thing I would ding it on is that the drums are pretty weak. I would love to re-EQ it so it's a bit more thumping. There's a dum-ch, dum-ch, dum-ch in there somewhere, but it's a very basic pattern and it's really far away, and I feel like it could come more to the fore for this to be a fully realized 80s synth pop record. But for what it is, I think it's really, really nice, and it is a great track on the album.
Yeah, totally agree. One of the standouts on side 2, and really lifts after having a new version of a track we already know, and then something which doesn't really have the meat to hold its own as a track. You then end up with this, which really does. Hugh's voice delivers this beautifully, and as a Hugh Lloyd-Langton track, it isn't a vehicle for him to play some epic guitar. It's just a really, really good song with a lovely vibe to it. You're kind of in that headspace just as that opening riff transports you there. So yeah, agree. Really, really nicely done, and a great one to occupy this spot on the album. And we get to something else, which is another mood change, because we get to Fahrenheit 451, which is a track they tried to record with Robert Calvert back in the Quark, Hawklords, PXR5 era, but for whatever reason, never laid it down, never recorded it or released it, but apparently it was floating around at the time. So this must be a Calvert lyric based on the book by Ray Bradbury about a dystopian future, people burning books, etc. And yeah, an interesting little punky tune, Matt.
Yeah, this feels much more like the classic Hawkwind. And it's interesting that you said this has been knocking around for a while, because this really does take me back to the kind of quarky do-re-mi era of Hawkwind with the shouted lyrics and, sounding much more raw in its delivery, especially at the beginning. There are solos and drums that show that the style's moved on a bit, but I guess a bit like Silver Machine, they've taken the spirit of a thing and recontextualized it, but they've kept what I guess made it good, which is that very kind of raw feel. It's nice to hear this again, given the kind of production that we've had throughout the album thus far. It's nice to have this as a little reminder of, they can still bring out that kind of scrappy jam that you want Hawkwind to be able to produce. So yeah, this is great. The riff at the beginning feels kind of familiar. I don't know if we've heard it before or if the delivery and chords are just similar to other stuff. Maybe it's just familiar because it's going back to that sound. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's got everything you look for in that Hawkwind jam, and it's interesting the way that they've taken the story, because I feel like it could have been a story which is more like High Rise, like that idea of a dirge about dead books and about what is society coming to when we're burning knowledge and that kind of thing. But actually, it's much more like they're taking the side of the mindless mob, and it's more like Damnation Alley or something, in that idea of we're being put in the context of maybe what it would be like, and it's like instead of them telling us that it's bad, they're going through it the other way, where they're showing people's reaction to it and leave us to come up with the idea that it's bad. I know at the very end they had that idea of like choking on smoke and that idea of like maybe this wasn't a good idea, but the rest of the lyrics are all very, yay, we're burning books, and it's for us to go, well, that's not a good idea, rather than them telling us burning books is wrong, which I think is actually probably the right way to do it. Mm-hmm. So this idea of like, yeah, the mindless mob rejoicing in this destruction, so we get to feel the dystopian overtones for ourselves rather than be told it's bad. I think it's good. The lyrics are delivered then in that shouty, mobby way, which is cool. I guess this is like a modern take, and it's not in the lyrics or the lyric sheet that I had, but the way they say Fahrenheit is almost like they're saying far right, which I thought was kind of interesting, because, when you think about book burning and like the Nazis and stuff, that is obviously like a far right thing to do normally. And so the idea of like when they say like the far right 451, I think they are saying Fahrenheit, but it's just the accent. But I heard that and I thought that was quite poignant, right now, thinking about some of the ways that the world has been leaning recently. That idea of being able to get far right in there was an interesting thing, even if I was just hearing it. That kind of spoke to me. But yeah, the overall like bouncy and liveliness of this is cool. The idea of rejoicing in the story is really interesting. There are some good lyrics, like it's like a mushroom cloud on the sun. That's kind of like the fiery version of a drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
that, which I thought was cool. Yeah, I think this is a cool little track. It's interesting that they've taken, another literary inspiration that isn't Moorcock and been able to do something with it. I don't remember when Fahrenheit 451 was written. I don't know whether or not this was done at the height of Fahrenheit 451 fever, or whether or not it was around for a while and they just liked it. But it's an absolute classic. So I guess you could do this anytime. You could do it today and people would still know what you're talking about. In fact, I think they did a TV show recently about Fahrenheit 451. I think I saw the first episode and never continued.
Yeah, it's been on TV and there's been several films, I think. There was a famous film. It was actually written in the 50s. So it had been around for quite a while. My guess is if it's written in the 50s, is it probably is a response to Nazism. I have read it, but I read it so long ago that I can't really remember. But no, you're right. It's interesting to see them take a different literary approach. But I loved your comparison to Damnation Alley. It's a heavy subject matter. And like with High Rise, as you so beautifully put it, I hadn't thought of it in these terms. With High Rise, they made a fantastically beautiful, emotional dirge about a dirge subject. But with Damnation Alley, they made a joyously upbeat track about a horribly dirge subject. Looking at it from that different point of view puts a completely different energy into it. And this is, you're right, it's that. This is the wonderful thing about you coming to these new, and as you so often do, find something in it that affects my own point of view on these things. I think it's a really nice way to phrase it. There is a nice punk energy in it. And you're right, it is no surprise when you realise that this has been hanging around since the era of Quark, etc., because you can imagine it landing in there. But it does a lovely job on this album, I think, in its injection of energy and punk spirit at that point. Nice little guitar solo in there as well by Hugh. Weirdly, there's a little run that he does when he does play a lot of notes very quickly, which sounds very, very much like guitar solo that Brian May of Queen does on a Queen album much, much later. And that's the only time I can think of where I will ever think of Hugh Lloyd Langton and Brian May in the same sentence. But strangely, it's just one of those things you pick up and it just reminds you of something else. So yeah, nice little track. And the end of that track takes us to one of those other little electronic-y, interstitially things, the scan.
Yeah, it's one of Hawkwind's little minute-long ideas, which has snuck into this album to make sure that it's a Hawkwind album. It's the only micro track on the whole album, which is good, I think, in my normal prejudice for them. But actually, I really like this one. It's actually really hard to get a synth to sound that plucky. I know, I've tried. So whoever's synth wrangling this one has done a really good job with the sound design and getting the synth to behave itself. I think the refrain running through some effects is a nice little experiment. I do feel like, again, maybe this is because this is getting into my echelon of synth understanding. Maybe I appreciate this a bit more now because I understand what's being done to it. But I think it's a nice little experiment for what it is. I'm not sure why it's called the scan, apart from it fits with the theme of the album. But as the audio equivalent of a little piece of ginger between sushi courses, it's a nice little thing. I don't mind it. It's certainly not one I skip. It's probably one of the best ones that they've done for me. But yeah, nice little thing. Not much more I can say about it, apart from technically I appreciate what they've been able to do.
Nicely put. This is kind of the role on the album that Void City should have had, being like a little interstitially thing. This does it very well. Nothing really to add there. Nice little keyboard riff going on. And I quite like the shouty scream at the end, which segues rather beautifully, actually, into the opening guitar of Waiting for Tomorrow, which is Hugh's second track on the album to round us out.
Hugh is on fire on this album. This track is glorious. I really, really like this track. I wasn't expecting to, but it's great because I feel like it's able to be both very atmospheric but also very 80s at the same time. But again, for me, this is starting to get that 80s-ness, which I am starting to appreciate. So I guess maybe I'm a little bit more touched by this because I can listen to it and go, oh, actually, there are things that I'm liking now in that stuff which I previously dismissed. So I feel like this track has done a very good job of winning me over, not just the album, not just the track, but almost the whole genre of potentially 80s stuff. I like the singing on this. It's got not the same delivery as Solitary Mind Games, obviously, but the same kind of lilt and animation, which I'm liking from Hawkwind on this album. I think the track is really great that it's able to flit from a more kind of soft rock. Again, I don't want to say Dire Straits again, but like, I feel like it's got that kind of like softness, but then it can flit into a much more frantic, intense affair for the chorus. So I love that shift in intensity that it's able to do, going from something a bit more like languid into something which is then just pounding the kick drum as we go Waiting for Tomorrow, bang, bang, bang. That's just really great in terms of just bringing the atmosphere and the intensity and the emotion up and down. We clearly have this theme of tomorrow, so we got the future. Again, the future is very present, which is strange if you think about the future and the present, but ignoring that, it brings the core of the album to the fore for the end, which is great. It's like packaged up everything we've been talking about, and it's like, and we're going to end on this, and it's a great way to end. There's, again, some great lyrics in this. I love Our Planet's Running Out of Steam. Very poignant right now, if anything. I guess it's been poignant for a very long time, but even more so when we've just had the hottest day in the UK on record. The fact that we talk about shelters as well, I feel like there's a Sonic Attack idea in here somewhere, that idea, but they haven't just redone Sonic Attack again, they've just incorporated it into this. So I feel like there's a lot of collection of ideas in this. We could even go back as far as maybe Children of the Sun in terms of some of these themes that we've had in that idea of waiting for tomorrow, but then also hiding from tomorrow is a great chorus. It gives us both a sense again of hope and unease at what the future could hold for our storyteller. It's very difficult to describe the sound in this, apart from it's just great. The guitars are great, the interplay between the guitars and the drums, and I guess after we've just had a couple of tracks which I've dinged the softness of the drums, the fact that this has a big kick on it and it sounds animated, it sounds poundy, it has this tidal kind of feel to it, which is just very emotional and very compelling. It's just a stone cold track to finish the album on, and it's one of those things where you really feel like you've left the album on a high, which Hawkwind does not always do. But I feel like at the end of this, I'm left kind of like, whew, yeah, that happened. And that's exactly what you want it to be. So I feel like this really, really delivers, and I'm very happy with it.
That's a great way to end it. A lot of times Hawkwind have a kind of final track, but then they put another little epilogue after it, which is usually something on a slightly more of a down note. This one, as you say, they end it with a big punching the air feel to it with the energy that's in this. And as you say, Hugh dominates side 2 of this album. Side 1 is this package of 4 songs that really kind of live together as a piece, and side 2 is Hugh all over it. So yeah, a great way to end the album, and sounds like it's an album that we've both really kind of enjoyed listening to. Just a quick word on the production. There are some people I've seen comment before on the production of the album as being a reason that they're not keen on it. And it's fair to say that the 80s probably stands alone in having a really, really particular sound to the production of almost all the music of any genre that comes out of it. Because all the technology becomes available in the 80s, so everybody slams it in there. And you've got band like Pink Floyd who produce Momentary Lapse of Reason in the 80s and have recently rebuilt it so that it doesn't sound as much like an 80s album. They've re-recorded it so that it sounds, in their own words, like a timeless album, because they said that they put far too much of these gimmickry things on it. When I listen to Choose Your Masques, I can definitely hear the fact that it's an 80s album, but rather than me thinking that that's a negative thing, it just means that it's an album produced of the time. It was a perfectly fine production in the 80s. How do you approach that?
I started thinking more like the commenters. I moved into a place where I'm more happy with it. Like I've said many a time now, I feel like the 80s has a lot of cultural baggage attached to it. It's one of the times where the look and the sound of the whole decade was so unique and so itself and so often pleased with itself that I think you can look at it with a sense of cringe or you can fall in love with it either ironically or actually. But I also wouldn't want to mess with this album too much because it's got enough of itself to sound like itself, but it's not being egregious. You know, there's certainly like when you get 80s pop, like real 80s pop,
Yep.
They're really leaning into it a lot more than this is. So I'm inclined to forgive it for sounding like it is because, you know, we don't ding the 70s for sounding like the 70s. We just happen to like the 70s sound more than we like the 80s sound. I don't think it's fair to attack the 80s for sounding like itself when we like other decades for sounding like itself.
That's very fair.
And again, listening to stuff like this, which is showing you don't have to lean in as hard as other things do, is actually making me warm to it more by the fact that, oh yeah, you don't have to do that. It's just a lot of people did, but a lot of people just also took the bits that worked and didn't lose themselves. Because I think the 80s can eat bands alive. You know, and you have like almost the 80s phase of a band. I was worried that Hawkwind would have that because I'm not a fan. But actually, like you said, they sound like the 70s in the 70s. They sound like the 80s in the 80s, but they sound like themselves through the filters of what they were making rather than they're at the mercy of the age.
Yeah, well said. Now, after the 40th anniversary reissue of Sonic Attack on the blue vinyl, we got to Church, and I found that there was a double album reissue of Church on heavyweight clear vinyl with the original album, and then a second album of kind of extended things that didn't make the album and whatever. I then looked and found that there was a double album reissue of Choose Your Masques on Back on Black Rock Classics. It's a nice package. They've lovingly recreated the cover and everything else. Heavyweight clear vinyl. And there's a second album of bonus material that we will get to in a second. They've done something rather horrible, though. They've squeezed Silver Machine to be the last track on side 1 after Utopia. And they've done that to make room on side 2 for the re-recording of Psychedelic Warlords, which would have been the B-side to the 10-year anniversary release of Silver Machine. So that means that side 1 is Choose Your Masques, Dream Worker, Arrival in Utopia, Utopia and Silver Machine, where you've now got to wait for several minutes of, if you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. And then Silver Machine rounds out side 1, which does not work for me. Side 2 then begins with Void City, which is completely wrong, and ends with Psychedelic Warlords after Waiting for Tomorrow, which again doesn't really fit. So don't mess with the running order of the tracks when you release reissues of albums. Just don't do it.
It's like they George Lucas'd the original.
Yes, exactly.
Tidy it up and then put it out again. Stop messing with it.
Yeah, exactly. The interesting thing is there's a whole lot of tracks here that are fully formed Hawkwind tracks on the bonus disc that I'd never heard before. And it's not like partially recorded demo versions, early track, didn't go forward with it. They're actually fully recorded versions of songs. And so when we talked about Silver Machine, you'd mentioned that the album doesn't need Silver Machine and that you could go without it. Because obviously we don't allow you to listen to all of the bonus material because we want you to hear the album as people who bought the album at the time heard the album. But after you'd listened to it and gone through your patented deep listening process and made your notes, I suggested that you listen to a few of these tracks, such as Candle Burning, Recent Reports, 5/4, Radio Telepathy. There's a few of them on there. If you were to remove Silver Machine from the album, which of those tracks, if any, could you put in its place? And what does that do to the running order of side 2 of the album? And you have reached a decision, have you not?
Yeah, let's start off with Candle Burning. Candle Burning is okay, but a little meh, and I'm happy to leave it at that. I think Recent Reports is kind of the same. The lyrical delivery bothers me in its basicness, and while the guitar's doing a spirited attempt at making the track into more of an event, it feels like the same as on better tracks that we have on the album. So, I'd leave this in the B-sides as well. I like 5/4, but then we'd have to lose the scan because I feel like they're very similar. And, maybe losing the scan isn't a huge loss, but we would have to do that, and that would change the way that side then works. But it's interesting that I thought the shout a minute into the scan was actually the start of Waiting for Tomorrow, but actually it's part of the main track of the scan. It's funny that they left that in because it does work. But I didn't realize it was part of a bigger track, so that was a nice bit of mixing for whoever then did that cut down. I think the noodle after what is currently the scan is okay, but I actually then feel like elongating it didn't do it any favors. I think probably it's better to just take that first minute and call it good. So I think they did the right thing there. Radio Telepathy is really well written and well performed. I think it's got a solid building structure. That idea of just it keeps going up and up and up. It makes great use of the guitar, synth, and the vocal ingredients, which then makes a classic Hawkwind track. So after the long build to the 3-minute mark, I was kind of expecting it to drop into more of a Hawkwind jam, but it just keeps plowing its own furrow, which, I like its commitment to its own idea. I feel like it could have gone a bit more crazy, but I like it for what it is. I'm wondering if it would be a pace killer after Utopia. I'm not sure. I think it could work as a lead into Void City after the instrumental of Utopia. And I think Leto is too close to Void City to be a credible replacement. It would essentially get a 9-minute long Void City, which, is probably too long for even the most ardent of Void City fans. I actually like Leto more than Void City because it has a more complex melodic structure and it has much more powerful drums. So I would swap Silver Machine and Radio Telepathy out. And then if it was possible, I might even swap Leto and Void City out, and I think then that would be a very complete album without the need for Silver Machine.
That's fair. I actually really like Recent Reports. I played it quite a lot, but Dave's vocal delivery is slightly annoying because he does it with an almost Frank Zappa American drawl, like authorization. Dave doesn't do the whole Robert Plant pretending to be American thing. He just sings in his own voice and with his own vocabulary and his own tone. So I kind of wish that he'd recorded it, in quotes, properly. But I quite like it as a song, but conceptually it would belong, given its subject matter, on Sonic Attack rather than Choose Your Masques. So I'd go with you with Radio Telepathy. With Radio Telepathy in a running order, I'd be tempted to start side 2 with Solitary Mind Games because of that amazing opening, and put Radio Telepathy into the spot where Solitary Mind Games is now, and kind of bookend side 2 with Hugh Lloyd Langton, because you've got the energy of Fahrenheit 451 punched into the middle to kind of elevate it a little bit. So that's probably what I'd do, but we kind of went for the same thing in the end. So yeah, just an interesting little aside really in the last couple of days leading up to us recording the episode. That's the music of Choose Your Masques, which obviously we've both been pretty positive about. And we come to the cover, which is by Andrew Christian and Terry Oakes. And Andrew Christian we've come to know and love because he worked on Sonic Attack and he worked on Church of Hawkwind, and we know that he had a good few credits: Eurythmics, Bowie, Bucks Fizz, Budgie, Dokken, Lionel Richie, Slade, even did some work with Bowie on Ziggy. So he's been around, he's done some stuff. Terry Oakes is the new name, And he's a very interesting guy. When you look up Terry Oaks, it turns out that he is an artist with a big reputation, particularly in fantasy artworks. So he did do the Hawkwind album, and he also did, I think, The Dragon, which is a Vangelis album. Here is what an art website says about him. A talented artist of vision and technique, Terry Oaks is entirely self-taught in his skills. This he did by studying the works of his childhood heroes, legendary comic artists like Jack Kirby and Frank Bellamy. Oaks received his first big break when he was commissioned to produce a book cover for Atlantis Rising. Since then, he has worked in many and varied fields, including poster design for the Sunday Times Ruler of All the Universe. I don't know what that is. Design commissions for David Wick's film of King Solomon's Mines, which I do know. A cover of Stephen King's novel The Shining, which I know. An album cover for Hawkwind, 3 Cheers, but most of his work has been in the field of fantasy games, where he has illustrated many games and game books, including a magnificent design for the huge Fighting Fantasy 10th Anniversary poster. I used to have so many Fighting Fantasy books. So he and Andrew Christian have put this album cover together. Matt, any first thoughts here on seeing this artwork?
Yeah, it's not my favorite kind of stuff. It's this is this is the part of the 80s which I'm still not a big fan of. Maybe I'll get there eventually, but musically I'm improving. Visually it feels a little cheesy to me. Everything's like turned up to 11.
It's the album cover of every thrash metal album ever made.
Exactly. And even though this one's more mystic, not that we're judging obviously these by the cover, but if I saw this in a record bin, I wouldn't have even thought about it. I'd have just gone no and just moved straight on, you know. It looks like it's going to have a lot more of the Moorcock theme to it than it actually does. And I wonder whether or not that's to its detriment. I feel like you could have called this something different and had a different art style and it would have been fine and maybe even a bit better for setting expectations of the album. Maybe it was supposed to be more and maybe it got eroded, but if I feel like the content of the album got eroded, but not the actual theme of the art. So I feel like people who look at this and buy it because of the art might be disappointed. And I feel like people who dismiss it because of the art and then don't get to hear the awesome music would also be disappointed. So I don't feel like this album art is really helping anyone. It looks like the soundtrack of a film or something. You know, it looks more like that than an actual album.
It's interestingly put. Hawkwind are at this point being marketed alongside heavy metal. You know, in its truest form. They play Donington Monsters of Rock. They don't particularly enjoy themselves because they're marketed as that, but they're not really that. Joe's book called them a genre of one, and this artwork does rather put them there. That said, there are some things in the artwork that I quite like. I quite like the overall darkness of the cover, and that mask that's in front of the hooded character becomes quite a common Hawkwind pin badge. There's an air of mystery to it, but yes, it is a little bit of its time and of its supposed genre, of which it kind of isn't really. Quite like the font for the album title, Choose Your Masques, which is at least continued on the back cover. The back cover of the album, for once, looks like the back cover of an album rather than a rejected front cover of the album.
It's a complete package for sure. Until I looked at the back cover, I didn't really realise that mask on the front is hawk-like. I don't know why I didn't, but I then looked at it again and went, oh yeah, it's of course Hawkwind, there's a theme, so that's cool. There's quite a lot that's Sonic Attack-like on this. That mask almost looks like it has angry eyebrows made out of more hawks, which the Sonic Attack kind of had the wings that were then also hawk heads, so that idea of hawkception is still here. I think that Hawkwind logo was on Sonic Attack as well, the kind of like spiky, cracklingy, lightningy one.
Yes, that's right.
Which I personally don't like. It's the only thing that looks a bit childish or a bit like First Thought, where the rest of it looks like it's been rendered really nicely. I wish that they'd have redone Hawkwind, maybe even like a Do-Re-Mi kind of Hawkwind, you know, a bit more like solid, a bit more authoritative to balance out the font that we have there, which is nicely like bold. And that looks a bit more metally, that font somehow. You know, it's angular and wrought and looks like it could be nicely done in silver, even though we have it in this dull burnished gold here. There's some nice details to it, but I think the ensemble piece of it makes it look like it is going to be a soundtrack to a kind of what was that film with the Skeksis in it and Gelflings and stuff?
Yeah, I know the one you mean. The one with the Muppet characters.
Yeah, exactly. The Jim Henson one.
Yeah, that. Whatever that's called.
Exactly. I like the fact we're not going to say it now because everyone will be shouting at their speakers, say like, it's clearly this.
Even when we remember what that's called, we're not going to say it.
Even though we have access to the internet and could look it up, we're not going to. But that film, it looks a little bit like it could be a soundtrack for that, which I think is deceptive. So I wish that the album art had been eroded as much as the music had in terms of theme.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? When we looked at the cover of Sonic Attack, which has a front cover and then a back cover, which looks like a front cover concept that they didn't go with, complete with totally different font design for the name Hawkwind. But we preferred that back cover version than we did the front. And yes, I do think the almost lightning boltish Hawkwind typography here, again, it screams thrash metal, like it has a Metallica look to it, which doesn't reflect who they are at this point. So there are some interesting bits on it. It's probably my favourite of the 3 RCA covers, but the bar is quite low for me to say that. Things get better from here, you'll be pleased to hear, I think, in the cover scheme of things. So that's our views on Hawkwind, Choose Your Masques. At this point, we like to see where this album lies in the Hawkwind Fans Worldwide Facebook group Top 40 Albums by Elric Newby. And we've had 1 or 2 surprising entries on this one recently. And this is no different because this in that book comes in at number 34, which is very, very low. Now, obviously, there are a huge number of compilations and live albums in all that. And when you take all of those out, you end up at somewhere around 22. I might have missed one somewhere on the line. It might be 21, but it comes around somewhere in 22. 1 behind Sonic Attack. So it's the lowest charting of the 3. So they're starting to wander off a little bit in the public perception. And in Hawkwind fandom, it's quite low down. And the RCA era as a whole, all 3 of them are quite low down rankings, which surprised me because in my growing up with Hawkwind and Hawkwind appreciation, the RCA years were some of the first ones that I had that I listened to. And they have almost a reputation that seems to belie where they are. Of course, it's a small self-contained group, and we know that there are differences in opinions when we did the Sonic Attack Ultimate Deathmatch Tournament. But this is the only group we have as a litmus test. So yeah, a little bit surprising there, Matt.
I'm very surprised. This is one of the most interesting albums for me that we've gone through. I'm wondering whether or not, like you said about the production, that unfortunately this album might have a bit of a taint of the 80s rejection. So maybe, unfortunately, this is a victim of the era it was made. But I'm surprised that it's as low down as it was. I was expecting this to be top 10, personally.
Well, we are definitely on the same boat in that one. Definitely one of my favourites. And occasionally something that I'm hoping Matt will like. Matt does like. More often than not, actually, to be fair.
I like to feel I'm still scary, though.
Exactly. I think everyone out there is still not able to predict accurately where you will go with any particular album. And that's good. It'll be interesting to see in the reboot with Mr. Crosby and his son where these albums will stand in future times. So Choose Your Masques then, Matt. It's obvious that we're both fans of this album. Round it out for us.
Overall, this is an album teeming with ideas and variety, realised compellingly and with very few, if any, Hawkwind weirdness stuff running through it and ruining the experience. I think the mix of ambient experiments along more solid Hawkwind jams and even some more dancey numbers shows their variety and, to a reasonable extent, their ability to pull them off. I hope they pay more attention to the drums in future. I know that the guy's now left. I hope they don't just replace him with a TRS 909 or something. I hope that they bring some organicness back to that. I miss the rhythmic power that they displayed with things like Do, Re, Mi and Levitation. I feel like that is a pretty decent ingredient to them. So I hope that comes back. And, you know, after the wishy-washy album that was Church, this leaves you on a real high after listening to it. For me, it fills my mind with ideas, it fills my heart with energy, and it fills my soul with experimental attitude. So I feel like you can't really ask for more than that, except for maybe a Simon House cameo on Fahrenheit 451 or something. That would have been pretty awesome. But, you can't have everything. This might genuinely be the first Hawkwind album that I go and buy. I know I have a few because you've given them to me, but I actually feel like this one would work nicely in my collection. So, I think I'm going to run off and find a correct version of it. Probably not the repress. I feel like that's a box ticked for one that I actually do want to go out and get. So, a big win.
Outstanding. I mean, previously on Twin Peaks, you'd really got into Quark, and 25 years had really kind of resonated with you and say, Do Re Mi. So, yeah, great to have another one that's up there. So we come to the question of questions. What from Choose Your Masques will go on to the Hawkbinge master playlist?
This was a hard-fought thing for me, but I am going to put Arrival in Utopia into the master playlist. I think it's the one that is still, after all this time, interesting from both a theme point of view, a music point of view. I feel like the whole thing comes together really nicely. It's one that we talked about for a very long time on this podcast. So the fact that it brings so many ideas, both latent and contemporary, together in such a nice little story is really nice, and something which not many people have really tackled before. So I feel like they broke some really nice ground, but also backed it up with a really nice catchy track as well. So I think that one is a solid one to put in for a great example of where they were in this album.
Cool, an outstanding selection. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people pretty happy with that. And in the Hawkbinge Sessions playlist, Volume 4, which is about to be published with all of those tracks that we talked about at the top of the episode from the bands you've been listening to, this is the final track selection. What will join Arrival in Utopia on the Sessions playlist of Volume 4?
It's going to be Waiting for Tomorrow. I think it's a great way of seeing out that playlist, but beyond that even, I think it's a great track that again shows Hawkwind's songwriting as well as their lyricism. I just love the push and pull between the contrast of the chorus itself and then the verses. I think the guitar's picked out really nicely. I just love the energy switch. I love the way it finishes. Every time it's done, I feel like the few seconds after it's finished, I feel like I kind of need to collect myself again a little bit, because I do feel like it's very energized, and you do feel like you need to wait for your heart to stop quickening its beat a little bit. I feel like it's very infectious, and it's really, really good. I mean, honorable mentions obviously to Silver Machine. Actually, I think there was a very real chance that there was an opportunity to put that in the master playlist, not just because it was a single, but while I think that version of it is great, I feel like the other tracks won over for original Hawkwind thinking. And also, again, shouts out to Fahrenheit 451, which I really, really liked, and Solitary Mind Games, which I really liked, but just the drums let it down for me for an inclusion. And even like the first track, I don't think we've ever had a first track put in, but this one was probably one of the closest it ever got to a consideration, apart from the masks thing, which meant that it didn't take the top spot. But there were so many tracks that could have made it, but I'm happy with the selections that were made. But it's also really nice to be spoiled for choice.
Outstanding. So you will find that alongside all of our other Hawkbinge Sessions playlist, and Matt will tell you where you can find those in just a minute or two. We are now moving into different territory, because Hawkwind now are somewhat dormant in the recording of studio albums for about 3 years. So for once, it takes longer for Hawkwind to record an album than it takes for us to record an episode of Hawkbinge. When we come back, it will be with the Chronicle of the Black Sword. I'm going to preempt a bunch of questions here, because I'm pretty sure that people will say, are you going to cover live Chronicles? And the answer is yes, we will, because there's things on Live Chronicles which are so relevant to this conversation. But we will be doing Chronicle of the Black Sword as our standard episode, looking at the record and the times and everything else. Then we will do a special on Live Chronicles, for which we have some pretty cool plans. So don't worry, Live Chronicles is the third of the big live albums that we will be referring to after Space Ritual and Live 79, and it will get its due consideration. And with that, Matt, I guess I've only got one thing to say to you, which is, if you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. If you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. If you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. If you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. If you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. If you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. If you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. If you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it.
You've been listening to Hawkbinge. It was devised and presented by Andy Hood and Matt Longstaff. The soundtrack was produced by Don Music Presents. To contact the show, drop us a message on Instagram, Facebook or Twitter by searching @Hawkbinge or send an email to podcast@hawkbinge.space. Hawkbinge is part of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. To find more great band-focused podcasts like this one, head to @DeepDivePodNet on Twitter and dive in. Thank you as always for listening. We'll see you next time.